are going to go up.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Hallie Jackson.
Good day. We are coming on the air with breaking news and a potentially huge breakthrough in the war between Israel with Hamas. NBC News has just confirmed moments ago that Hamas has released 2 American hostages. Again, 2 American hostages who had been captured during that Hamas terror attack inside Israel more than 2 weeks ago. That's according to multiple sources. The news coming about just an hour or so after a senior Hamas official told NBC News that they would release the hostages if Israel stopped bombing Gaza. That is the territory controlled by Hamas. The State Department has said that Americans are believed to be among those kidnapped, although it is not clear at this point, again, where things stand with the larger group of hostages who have been taken. I want to bring in NBC News foreign correspondent Josh Letterman, who is live for us in Israel in the region. Josh, what do we know?
Well, Hallie, we are hearing from 3 sources with knowledge of this release who have confirmed to Richard Engel, Tom Winter, and myself that these 2 U.S. citizens have now been released by Hamas. Now, we want to be very clear about what we don't know right now, namely the identities of these people. We also don't know where they are, whether they are still in the Gaza Strip, whether they would have been moved into Israel, into Egypt, potentially under the care of the Red Cross, and that is a major open question right now, but we do know that Hamas is describing these 2 U.S. citizens as a mother and a daughter. Now, the remainder of our sources, we have not yet been able to pin down those identities, but this release, if we get more information about exactly who they are, would be the first hostages known to have been released since the beginning of this crisis 2 weeks ago. And it comes after earlier today we heard from Israel's military confirming that not only do they believe there are about 200 people who are held hostage in the Gaza Strip, but that they believed that most of them were alive. That had been a big open question since the start of this, whether those hostages were alive or whether some or all of them might already be dead. But Israel's military leaving some hope for the successful return of those hostages, as they said that they do believe the majority of them are alive, Hallie.
Josh, do we know anything at this point about the potential of family notification now to the loved ones of these people who we believe have been released?
Well, that would certainly be the first step that the U.S. government would want to make before it would say anything publicly. At this hour, we are awaiting a State Department briefing that was scheduled to take place right around now. If the U.S. government is in a position where they have done family notification and are able to make anything public to the rest of us, that would likely be the place where we would first hear that from the government. But so far, there has been no official comment from the U.S. government. We have reached out to the Israeli government, of course, to see if they have any information that they can share as well, and we'll bring those details to you as soon as we get them. But for right now, the U.S., the Israeli side have been very quiet about this, in part because, remember, even if these 2 Americans are now somewhere safe, there are still nearly 200 hostages, including some Americans, who are believed to still be hostage in the Gaza Strip. And the big focus right now will be on making sure that any efforts to bring additional people home safely are not derailed, Hallie.
Josh, thank you. I'm going to ask you to stand by for us. I want to bring in our Raf Sanchez, who's been reporting from Israel since the start of this war. And Raf, since nearly the minute after that Hamas terror attack about 2 weeks ago that began this war, there had been an intense diplomatic scramble to try to get some of these hostages released. Talk to us about where those discussions stand and specifically the role of the Qataris here.
Yeah, well, Hallie, the Hamas's so-called military wing says this deal to apparently release 2 American citizens came about after Qatari mediation. We know the Qataris have been involved from a very early hour in this. They provide a lot of the money, a lot of the humanitarian funding that has kept Gaza going over the last couple of years. They have direct lines of contact with senior Hamas officials far beyond what many other governments have, and they are the people who the Americans, who the Europeans, who the Israelis often turn to when they have messages that they need to deliver to Hamas and when they have answers that they need to hear back. Now, this claim that 2 Americans were released was made by the spokesman of the so-called military wing of Hamas. He has been the source of what little we know about the hostages being held in Gaza. He goes by the name Abu Obaida. That is not his real name. He tends to appear either masked in video videos or he releases voice statements. And this was a highly choreographed production, Hallie. At about 7:30 local time here, the sun had gone down, Shabbat had begun in Israel. Hamas put out a statement saying that they were about to reveal important news. And just about 7 minutes later, simultaneously in both English and Arabic, they said that they were releasing this American mother, this American daughter, for what they say are humanitarian reasons. And they framed this, Hallie, as a rebuke of the statements that President Biden made when he was in Israel earlier in the week, condemning Hamas as a terrorist organization. They claim that they are doing this to send a message to the American people that President Biden's claims were not true. Hallie.
The president, of course, reiterating that condemnation of Hamas in that rare primetime Oval Office address to the nation just last night. Raf, thank you. I want to bring in our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who has been covering this on the ground in Israel. Richard, you are among the tip of the spears for the reporting effort here. Tell us more about what we're learning and where this is headed.
So NBC News can confirm that 2 Americans have been released by Hamas. That follows this statement from Hamas saying that it was releasing or did release an American mother and daughter for humanitarian reasons. We can confirm from 3 independent sources from multiple reporters at NBC News that these 2 Americans are free. It is a major development, and I was also told by a senior negotiator directly involved in this process that, quote, hopefully this is just the start.
Yeah. Well, that's the question here, Richard, is does this perhaps indicate that this could be the beginning of the dam breaking and the potential for the release of more hostages in the days to come?
That is the goal. That is what the negotiators are working on, that this would be the start. That was what I was told directly. This is just the start, hopefully. And it also follows an important statement by the Israeli military earlier today. The Israeli military said, and the Israeli military has been extremely closed-lipped about this for obvious reasons, that there are 200 hostages, about 200 hostages. There are still an unknown number of missing people being held in Gaza, and that most of them are alive. The Israeli military also said that 20 of those hostages are under 18 and that 10 to 20 are over 60. So if you look at the sequence of events here, it does indicate that there is movement on this issue. You have the Israelis giving an extraordinary level of detail, so it seems that they must have been given proof of life in order to come out and say that they believe that most of the hostages are still alive and to give a breakdown of their ages. Then you have this choreographed release by Hamas saying that it has done it, and then just in the last few minutes, 3 independent sources confirming to NBC News that 2 Americans have been released.
What does this mean, Richard, for the potential for any further movement as it relates to a ground attack by Israel into Gaza? Because as you reported earlier in the week, one of the conditions that Hamas had put on any release, potentially of hostages, even before this, was essentially a ceasefire.
So we've been following this directly quite closely for the last several days. And yes, I spoke with a senior Hamas official a few days ago, and he made this offer on our air, saying that Hamas is willing to release all civilians, including Israelis, is willing to release all foreigners held by Hamas. That would include dual nationals, if the airstrikes are stopped. Now, this release today seems to have happened while under fire. The airstrikes have not stopped. So I do not know if Hamas has changed position. Perhaps that is why only 2 people have been released for, quote, humanitarian reasons. These negotiations are being held in secret, but it does seem very clearly now, with 3 sources telling NBC News that these 2 Americans have been freed, that there is movement in a clearly positive direction for the families of these hostages and potentially for the course of this war. There are still many thousands, tens of thousands of Israeli troops positioned around Gaza, poised for an invasion. I do not know if this slows down that invasion, but if there is progress being made, it is something that negotiators will want to and do want to pursue. Because as I said, this this Arab negotiator who's directly involved in these talks told me, hopefully, this is just the start.
Do you have any understanding yet, Richard, or do we have any sense yet of how Hamas is looking at the foreign nationals that are believed to have been kidnapped and abducted out of Israel versus Israeli citizens, and whether there might be any sort of weight given to either one of those categories here in the release of hostages moving forward?
So what Hamas is saying publicly and what ends up happening in the course of negotiations may be two different things. But what Hamas has said publicly is that the Israeli soldiers will not be released, that the Israeli soldiers would only be released under very extreme conditions, that they would be released if Israel releases all Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. But they said that Israeli civilians, and foreigners, that is, Israelis with foreign passports, that they could be released immediately when the time is right. That is what they've said in the past. And now, under fire, Hamas says for humanitarian reasons, it has released these two Americans, as confirmed by three sources.
Richard Engel, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you to stand by for just a moment because I want to bring in now Martin Fletcher, who is an author, of course, a former NBC News correspondent and our former Tel Aviv bureau chief. Martin, we are so glad to have you here. You have shared publicly now over the course of the last 24 hours that two members of your wife's family have been among those taken hostage. Here we are now. Reporting here, as confirmed by NBC News based on multiple sources, that two Americans have been released, according to Hamas, a mother and daughter. Can you give us any insight into anything you may have heard, any kind of potential sense of hope among your family?
Well, I just heard literally 30 seconds ago, Hallie, that they have not received any information yet from anybody. But of course, the family is hopeful and praying because they are Americans. My family, they're American citizens. They are a mother and daughter. As far as we know, they're the only American mother and daughter who've been kidnapped and held hostage. So obviously, we're hoping this is them. It would be a miracle for the family. And hopefully it's the beginning of something larger. You know, the question then now becomes, what did Israel give to get them out? And Israel holds 30 female security prisoners, Palestinian security prisoners in its jails, and about 150 minors, young people. And there's been talk in the early on about a possible prisoner swap, Hamas letting the women and children go in return for the women and children in Israel's jails, the security prisoners. So maybe that's going to be the next step, a larger prisoner exchange. So for this family, for my family, of course, everyone's praying that our particular tragedy potentially could be over. But I have to say one thing, it's not the end of it for this family, even if it is my relatives who've been released. My cousin, who's been giving me the information, was at a funeral this morning for another cousin who was killed. And his wife, another member of my family, which I didn't even know about, is also held hostage in Gaza. So there's 2 out, 1 to go for our family if this is the case. So this is a tragedy with just one family out of many, many praying and hoping.
It speaks to the nightmare that so many families, Martin, are living at this moment after their loved ones had been taken by Hamas in that terror attack now nearly 2 weeks ago. Martin, can you help us understand? I know you only recently found out, I think it was just within the last day, that these family members had indeed been abducted. Do you know how it happened? Do you know the conditions under which they were taken?
Yeah, they were on kibbutz Nahal Oz, right in the south of Gaza. It's one of those kibbutzim where there was no help from the army or the police for many hours. And as this is a young couple, a mother and daughter rather, visiting from Evanston, Illinois. They're Americans. They were visiting their grandmother on the kibbutz. It was her 85th birthday, and the attack suddenly happened, and people were killed and running and racing. And the last that my two family members were seen was hands tied and being dragged away towards Gaza by the terrorists. So that's the last anybody heard of them. And now there's this news that maybe they're the mother and daughter who have been released. I mean, what a miracle for one family, and many more families waiting for a similar miracle. I don't want to emphasize how happy we are before it happens, because I know so many other people are still suffering bitterly.
Martin, I just want to reiterate for folks who may just be joining us now as part of our special coverage here on NBC News that we're talking about two members of your wife's family believed to have been abducted by Hamas here. You, of course, know this region so well. You're our former Tel Aviv bureau chief here at NBC News. Talk for a minute about the significance here. There was a point in this war in just the last 13 days where it almost seemed perhaps impossible that any of these hostages might be released. And now a potential glimmer of hope, not just for your family, but for so many others.
Yes, and we have to wonder why that is. I mean, is it a response to President Biden's speech calling them terrorists, and they wanted to show that they're not that? Is it the humanizing of the question about going on TV and talking about this is your family, who are these people? But I think there must be Hamas is a very clever, calculating organization, and so is this a way to get sympathy for their cause? Is it simply part of a wider plan swap with Israel and the Palestinians? I hope that is the case, because that would mean more people would be freed. Did Hamas respond to an instant of some kind? Was it a sudden calculation, or is it part of their plan to release hostages slowly? It's all part of a psychological warfare game against Israel. They're succeeding very well, I must say. Israel is on edge, but the whole region is now on the edge of an abyss. When Israel goes in with a ground invasion, if indeed they do, which is not a given, because Israel's been on the edge of a ground invasion several times before and didn't do it in a major way. But presumably this time they will. Priority number one will be to defeat Hamas. Only priority number two will be to find and protect the hostages, who we know are now human shields for Hamas terrorists. So, there's a lot going on. We just have a few short days, a brief window of opportunity to get as many hostages out as quickly as possible before the ground invasion begins, because once there's a massive fighting on a ground invasion, hundreds of thousands of Israeli troops inside Gaza fighting, no one's going to get any hostages out in that situation. Not
you talk about this, Martin, you're right. I mean, you talk about this very short window of the opportunity that is perhaps opening here. The backdrop to that is the diplomatic scramble that is happening in the region, that is happening internationally with Western leaders. We know President Biden made a visit to Israel, of course, earlier this week, and these behind-the-scenes conversations that are happening in the most urgent of ways to try to get some of these hostages out.
That's right, and they've been going on for some time. And Israel always relies on the countries of Qatar and Egypt, backed up by the United States. That's what's happened in the past. There's been not on this scale, but there's been situations before where there's been prisoner swaps. We always remember Gilad Shalit, who was the Israeli soldier who was held for 5 years by Hamas, and Israel in the end swapped 1,000 prisoners to get one person back. At the moment, it's a struggle. It's a struggle for intelligence. Where are the hostages? Well, Israel couldn't find one guy in 5 years. Are they going to find 200 hostages in a few days? Unlikely. So the diplomatic solution, this release of the two women, is a wonderfully optimistic moment in this situation. But it's a very brief moment, and we have to hope that there's a wider plan as part of their release, that more people will be freed. But it's going to happen through diplomatic negotiations, unlikely through any kind of military maneuver.
Martin, you referenced the difficulty in a potential rescue of hostages versus negotiations for their release. Part of that, we know that, for example, the Biden administration has sent over experts in sort of the technical logistics of how that might unfold, but it is extraordinarily difficult because of how densely populated, how packed, essentially, Gaza is. Explain that.
Well, Gaza is think of this. Gaza is 139 square miles large. That's all. It's only 25 miles from the northern tip to the southern tip. That's like a marathon. I mean, a marathon runner will run that in 2 hours. That's the entire length of Gaza. And yet there is 300 miles, we're told, 300 miles of tunnels built by Hamas underneath Gaza. That's what the Israeli army will face going in. These tunnels have got entries and exits, and they've got side exits and multiple exits inside. buildings, inside homes, probably inside schools and hospitals, who knows. There's hundreds of entries and exits. So you can imagine the Israeli soldiers fighting block by block inside a very crowded area, and suddenly behind them, Hamas fighters pop up from the tunnels to ambush them. So it's going to be a very bloody exercise, and Israel, of course, knows that, and that's one reason why they're pounding the area to smithereens. The areas they're bombing are the areas they believe the Israeli troops will go. They're trying to loosen, to loosen up the area before the troops get there to save the troops. So there's still a lot more bombing to be done before the ground invasion. One question is, why has the ground invasion been delayed for so long? And the answer is because Israel is gathering intelligence about where their targets are, and they want to bomb those targets before the Israeli troops get there. It's a slow operation. Israel didn't just call up 350,000 reserves and charge into the Gaza Strip. No, they're doing it stage by stage. And the first stage is to gather intelligence, and they haven't finished that stage yet. When they have, that's when they're going to go in.
Martin, I'm going to ask you to stay with us for as long as you can. I know that you need to check your phone, check any text message. I want to give you an opportunity here, a minute or two, to do that. And while you do, let me go to our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who is joining us now on the phone. And Richard, one of the things we heard Martin talk about was the sense that so many in Israel have been on edge after that terror attack now on October 7th here. Can you give us a sense, as you've been on the ground now there for days, of what the sentiment is like where you are?
Oh, it is not just Israel that is on edge. Israel is angry. Israel feels that its security was violated. Israel feels that it's embarrassed. And, of course, this is a small country, and everyone here knows someone who was killed or someone who is being held hostage. Just look at Martin's own personal story, his family, now as once again a journalist and also telling the story of what he is experiencing. And it is the entire region that is on edge. I think that is why there is so much pressure coming down upon Hamas. There is so much diplomatic effort underway to avert this from escalating into a much wider war, because the concerns across the region are, if the Israelis do go ahead with this anticipated offensive and go in heavy, that we could have a regional war on the level of 1948 or 67, a war that once again permanently changes the map of the Middle East. And there are countries, including the United States, that don't want to see that kind of instability. So there's a lot of efforts to de-escalate this. Of course, Israel insists that its ultimate mission is to destroy and disarm Hamas and make sure that it can never do that again. And I'm quite confident that Israel will continue its military operation and will continue to pursue Hamas for years, potentially for decades. But is there a way to get these hostages out and also achieve Israel's military objective of destroying Hamas's military capability and not having the entire Middle East spiral into an uncontrollable war that is already bringing in the United States in military, with attacks on military bases in Iraq, Syria, rockets fired from Yemen. This is already edging toward a Middle East war. Martin said it earlier. We are at the edge of an abyss, and we are starting to slide down it. And what is happening right now is potentially a sign that there is some progress for these families, and potentially some progress toward a de-escalation. Doesn't mean Israel is going to stop its military objective. Maybe it can accomplish its military objective without triggering a new catastrophic war in the region. But just because two hostages, as we could confirm, have been released, does not mean that this crisis is in any way over.
It's an excellent point, Richard Engel. Thank you. We know, of course, dozens of other hostages, perhaps as many as roughly 2,000, according to the 200, I should say, according to the Israelis, are still being held by Hamas. I want to bring in our senior White House correspondent, Gabe Gutierrez, just quickly here, because Gabe, nothing from the White House yet, right? No official confirmation through the administration yet?
Not yet, Hallie. So we do have calls into the National Security Council, but just a short time before this news broke, President Biden speaking very briefly and was asked about that humanitarian aid that was supposed to head from from Egypt into Gaza that was expected as early as today. The president now saying it's now expected within the next 24 to 48 hours. But with news of these hostages being released, Hallie, this has been a huge priority for the Biden administration over the last several days, including in that whirlwind trip that President Biden made to Israel. And Hallie, as you know, yesterday, the president making just his second Oval Office address since he took office, trying to link the war in Israel as well with the war in Ukraine. So this news of these hostages being released coming on the same day.
Gabe, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to go back to Martin Fletcher. Martin, I understand that you have been in contact with your family. What can you tell us?
Well, my family has not been told anything at the moment, as far as I know. I was last on with them a few more minutes, but Israel TV, Channel 11 in Israel TV, has just said that, in fact, Judith and Natalie Renan have been released. So that's according to Israel TV, Channel 11. I've just been told that now. So
okay, and to be clear, Martin, you have not heard this from members of your family through any sort of official notification process yet, correct?
Exactly. I have not been told officially. As far as I know, they haven't been told officially. Well, what they were guessing is that they probably wouldn't have been released anyway to the Israeli side. They would have been taken to the border with Egypt and released to the Egyptians. That's the speculation.
In the minute we have left here, Martin, can you give us a sense of the incredible personal toll this has taken on your family? And I have to think at this moment, it is a moment not just of incredible optimism, but also anxiety and stress and concern here.
Well, you know, as I emphasized earlier, it's not only my family, it's all the families and everybody who sympathizes with them. It's just this extraordinary sense of vulnerability. You know, the Holocaust, the phrase never again, well, it happened again. That's what happened in the south of Israel. The Jews were slaughtered, they were vulnerable, and there's a great sense of vulnerability and fear and anguish among the Israelis, among the Jews in Israel. And as I think I mentioned earlier, this, you know, assuming this is all true, I hope it is, that according to Channel 11, it is true. They have been released, Judith and Natalie. They have been released. If that's true, hopefully it is true. Don't forget, for the same family, they buried somebody else today, and the person they buried, his wife, is still a hostage in Gaza. So this is not over by a long way.
Yeah, it is still a long stretch ahead. Martin, I have to ask, and I think viewers of NBC News will know you. You will be familiar to them as our former Tel Aviv bureau chief. These are members of your wife's family. How is your wife doing, Martin?
She's crying a lot.
Yeah, understandably. Of course. Of course. An incredible moment, an incredibly delicate moment. Martin, we are so grateful to you for being with us, for talking us through very much in real time what is unfolding with your family. There are so many people here and around the country who are hoping it is, in fact, your family, that any hostages have been released, of course, is a significant breakthrough here in this Israel-Hamas war. Martin, thank you for being with us. I want to thank Richard Engel, Raf Sanchez, Josh Letterman, Gabe Gutierrez. We're going to have a lot more coverage here of these very fast-moving developments right here on NBC News. More coverage ahead on our streaming channel, NBC News Now. You can also find us with the latest on NBCnews.com. I'm Hallie Jackson. Thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.